December 31st, 1939. Suddenly, the crowd parted to allow the Kremlin master to make his way through. Nobody could have guessed the surprise that awaited them. A moment later, through the same doors, another Stalin would enter. But what was it? A ghost or a hoax? That's how they tried to explain it to the frightened guard. Along with Comrade Stalin, there came a heavily made-up actor, Gelovani, to the Kremlin. It turns out, Stalin really did have doubles.
It was then, after the First World War, in a clash of ideologies, communist and capitalist, that the Cold War had its origins. In 1940, Hitler struck west. By mid-1941, France, Belgium, Holland, Norway, Denmark, Yugoslavia, and Greece had been added to his conquests.
It was my father who explained all of this to me. He was one of them. You see, I am the last remaining child of the philosophers. But after he revealed the truth, my father was killed by that same shapeless, formless organization. And my father isn't the only thing the philosophers have taken from me.
In the summer of 1941, the British and Dominion forces in Egypt were stalemated. Rommel wasted little time. Within 6 weeks of arriving, he attacked, driving the British back into Egypt. During the stalemate, a 24-year-old commando officer, David Sterling, lay in hospital in Alexandria. He was recovering from injuries caused by a parachute jump that went wrong. One of the most notable factors about the war in the Western Desert was the immense distances that needed to be covered. The distance from Tripoli, where the Africa Corps had landed, to Alexandria, the main British base, was over 1,000 miles. There were few proper roads, and to the south was an open flank of desert which could be navigated by experienced troops. Sterling realized that this made Rommel's supply lines particularly long and vulnerable. So too were the Africa Corps airfields and supply dumps. Attempts to disrupt them through commando raids from the sea had failed, because Axis forces were too alert. Sterling concluded that a possible alternative was small groups of men which would be infiltrated through the Axis lines. Not only would the enemy find it more difficult to detect them, but they were capable of causing as much damage to supply dumps and airfields as larger bodies. He also proposed that his force should be sent in by parachute and operate in conjunction with any future British offensive.
For 6 months, battle raged at Stalingrad.
German science led the world in a number of areas by the beginning of the 20th century. During the Second World War, scientists developed a number of research projects which Goebbels presented the German public as capable of bringing out a reversal of Germany's declining military fortunes. In 1943, Hitler himself held out the prospect of what he called hitherto unknown, unique weapons that would soon come into action. But significantly, the best publicized of these were named V weapons, standing for Vergeltung or retribution. In other words, their stated purpose was to pay back the Allies for the damage they'd done, not necessarily, in other words, to win the war. The V1, shown here, was a pilotless flying bomb powered by an intermittent pulse jet set to run out of fuel as it reached London. In effect, it's what we would call now a cruise missile. But these are rather slow-moving, relatively speaking, and it wasn't too difficult to shoot them down from anti-aircraft guns, and many of them, more seriously for the program, ran out of fuel too soon, fell into the sea. About half of them failed to reach their target. Much more dangerous, at least in principle, was the V2. This is a liquid-fuel ballistic rocket developed by the young scientist Wernher von Braun. By October 1942, he'd solved the difficult problems of creating a stable trajectory, effective guidance systems, aerodynamic reliability, and Hitler ordered mass production to begin.
London was not anymore opposed to the occupation of Iran by Russian troops. In late August of 1941, they jointly forced Reza Khan to resign, exiled him to South Africa, and proclaimed his youngest son his successor.
Then on December the 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
The attack is intended as a preventative action to stop the US Pacific Fleet from interfering with military strikes the Empire of Japan is about to unleash against the overseas territories of the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, France, and the United States in Southeast Asia.
The cryptological onus shifted from William Friedman and the Army Signal Intelligence Service to naval codebreakers. In the months following the attack in Pearl Harbor, Japan went on an unprecedented spree of expansion and naval conquest. From the first week of December of 1941 through the spring of 1942, Japan recorded a stunning string of victories, capturing Bangkok, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Manila, Bataan, Corregidor, Singapore, and Burma in less than 6 months. The first American victory in the Pacific was scored not over territory, it was scored over access to information, quietly by the naval codebreakers. In January of '42, they finally succeeded in breaking the Japanese naval code JN-25. On the 3rd of June 1942, the Japanese began their attack on the Aleutians, just south of Alaska, but decrypts had told the American commanders that this was just a feint. The real battle was scheduled to begin on the following morning. While the smaller Japanese strike force pounded Midway, American carrier-based aircraft pounced on the main Japanese fleet. Three of the Japanese carriers were sunk within 4 minutes. By the end of the first day, all 4 were destroyed.
D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, the biggest seaborne invasion in history, lands in France.
In June of 1944, the Cobras and I took part in the landing at Normandy. We'd been given a top-secret mission to locate and destroy enemy V-2 rocket installations. I was pregnant at the time. The sorrow was the father. I gave birth on the field of battle. A beautiful baby boy. But my child was snatched away from me by the philosophers.
Marine Corps veteran Sam So was a code talker, one of the Navajo whose voice held the keys to victory at Iwo Jima. A 100 years before the war, these canyons were the battlefield, and the Navajo's adversary not a people from across the Pacific, but the United States itself. Legend holds that their warriors used a secret language on raids against their enemies. Even after they were confined to the reservation, the Navajo held proudly to their culture, their language, and their lands. But for Sam and his generation, Navajo traditions were under attack. Children from the reservation were being sent to schools where the words and ways of the white man were forced upon them.
You were restricted from talking your native tongue. You were to speak English only. You pick up those little pieces.
Keith Little also served as a code talker. Like Sam, he was born to the Navajo language but schooled in a foreign tongue. Subtle tones and complex structures make Navajo all but impossible for outsiders to understand. On the battlefield, it made an unbreakable code. The Marines' warrior language started with the English alphabet. Common Navajo words stood for individual letters, and the code talkers simply spelled out the messages.
We sent it as a code, and then it'll be received on the other end as a regular message.
To confuse the enemy further, they played word games and used metaphors.
What we call rockets, ground boiler.
A fly speck of rock, just 8 square miles. Iwo Jima held airfields vital to the final approach and invasion of Japan. That made it a rock worth dying for. Iwo Jima was not just an island. It was a fortress Japan had carved out of volcanic rock. Every outcrop bore heavy guns. Caves and blockhouses led to miles of tunnels. And in the tunnels, an invisible army, 22,000 strong.
And it was raining, it was slick that day, and we were wet and cold.
Code talkers hit the beach with the opening waves of the attack. At first, the Japanese held their fire. Then they sprang the trap.
You get that withering fire to look to you that it is impossible to survive in. Impossible to come out alive, to even lift your head. It's awfully scary. On Iwo it was like that.
Getting beyond the beachhead became a nightmare for radio man and rifleman alike.
And I look over here and say, how can people survive with all that shelling and bombing?
Yeah, I remember that he says, I want you guys to protect this goddamn Indian because we need him. He's got secrets that cannot be understood by the Japs. He didn't call them Japs, he called them gooks. I never saw an enemy, a live enemy. Everything was quiet, everything was spooky. Weird, you might say.
In their underground strongholds, outmanned, outgunned, the Japanese refused to surrender. Their orders were to fight to the death, taking as many Marines with them as they could. As the Marines pushed deeper into the island, they left a trail of corpses. In traditional Navajo belief, evil will come to those who walk among the dead. And Iwo Jima had become Chi'idita, a land of the dead.
Code-breaking had played a vital role in some of the most decisive Allied victories in the Pacific, but the war wasn't over yet. In the months before the planned invasion of Japan, decrypted traffic showed that Japanese ambassadors were looking for an avenue to discuss peace. Unfortunately, the military leaders who by then controlled the Japanese government were of a different mind. They hoped to inflict enough casualties on the Americans that they could dictate peace terms.
General Groves was pressing for a test. The war in Europe was over, and he wanted to have the weapon available before the end of the Potsdam Conference.
And Groves set about where are we going to do it, and they found a place in New Mexico in the desert, and they called it the Trinity Site. The weather's a problem. Oh my God, the thunderstorms, rain and lightning.
The test was a triumph.
It was like you were lifting the curtain in a darkened room and a bright daylight coming in.
But the shockwave was amazing.
I did not care to see literally what would kill people.
It was a cool desert morning. The sun had not quite come up. Suddenly, on that cold background, the heat of the sun came to me before the sun rose. It was the heat of the bomb, not the light, but the heat was the first thing that I could feel.
We scientists have one job, to solve the technical problems. We don't know anything about the Japanese. We don't know anything about politics. We should shut up about all those things.
The question was, where?
And there was a target list that had been worked out in advance. Hiroshima obviously was top of the list, and one reason being that it is somewhat on a flat terrain surrounded by high hills.
If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
As scientists, we deplore the use to which a beautiful discovery has been put. But we can assure you that unless Japan surrenders at once, this rain of atomic bombs will increase many-fold in fury.
I myself got into the bomb shelter and waited for instruction what to do. And then we came out to the bomb shelter by curiosity to the doorway and looked out and saw first victim walking like a ghost. A young lady walking with an arm extended. Her clothes were hanging from her body. Her hair just burned off. It was staring straight ahead. So it wasn't her clothes hanging, it was her skin hanging. The city was ablaze, fire. So then he saw another relative doing the same thing. And then he walked downstream and then waited till the tide subsided and waded across the river to the city and started looking for any sign of me. You know, clothes burned off, face was burned, the name tag was burned off, so there's no way of telling who the person is. So he was going one person to another, are you sure? Are you sure? And if there was an answer, he just kept on going.
Beyond the Nagasaki bomb, there was another bomb ready to go within 10 or 12 days, and a bomb after that, and a bomb after that.
The celebration at the gadget's success and the war's end quickly turned to contemplation and fear. What had they done? What would it mean for the future?
It was like a gigantic knife of light slashing the sky in two. A mass of clouds came out, climbing upwards with a huge pillar of red fire in the middle, like a volcano in the sky. For a while, I lost myself and stared at this terrible, beautiful display.
Hiroshima University professor Toyofumi Ogura wrote a letter to his wife.
When I regained my senses, the broken, demolished city of Hiroshima was in front of me. The city where 400,000 people lived, where 7 rivers run, the city of water, Hiroshima, was gone. There was a wave of people on the road who were injured and burnt. A pile of lives blown into this spot by the explosion wind. Not a human being, but a mass of wounded flesh was there. It was a terrifying, horrific scene of hell.
Over 140,000 people were killed by the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. It has never been determined how many later died from wounds or cancer. Japan surrendered. The war was over.
Pandemonium broke loose here 2 hours ago. Firecrackers are all over. You can hear them now, I know, across the street. I'm Kenneth Cowell from Arizona. Okay, boys. Goddamn war's over. What do you got to say about this? This is the happiest day of my life. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing.
The signal intelligence and cryptological organizations that were built by the United States military were not dismantled when hostilities ceased, as they had been after the First World War.
Leaders of World War II became the military and civilian leaders of the post-war world. They very clearly understood the value that code making and code breaking had given them in World War II, the advantage it had provided. They were determined to protect this capability in the post-war world.
And they knew the value of holding your hand close. Nobody should know your secrets. So we kept not only a capability going of looking at other nations' codes and getting intelligence from them, but we kept the effort going to develop secure systems for the United States.
In 1952, President Harry S. Truman consolidated many of the country's cryptological responsibilities and resources with the establishment of the National Security Agency. William F. Friedman became its chief technical consultant, and 2 years later he became special assistant to the director. When looking back at cryptology in the 20th century, the codes and ciphers, the countries that used them, and the men and women who created and broke them, a few things become apparent. Nations will always endeavor to keep secrets, and other nations will endeavor to learn those secrets. Today, computers shroud communications in a veil of complexity undreamed of by Herbert Yardley. But the lessons of his work hold true. In his book, The American Black Chamber, Yardley said, "If no attempt is made to decipher messages during quiet periods when there seems no likelihood of important issues arising, the true aims and intentions of a government cannot possibly be ascertained. One never knows at what moment another government will start a movement prejudicial to our interests."
Stalin persuaded Roosevelt that his safety was best assured by residence at the Soviet embassy. The embassy had been specially prepared for his visit. It was bugged.
Stalin told me that the task he was putting to our group, and particularly to me, was ethically very unattractive. However, the position of the USSR was so serious that he had to know what our allies were thinking.
Stalin was very skillful in dealing with Roosevelt and Churchill. Even Churchill began to quite like him, you know, and talk about Uncle Joe. It was quite affectionate term.
Every day at 8 in the morning, I had to go to Stalin. I went with all the transcripts, in Russian and in English. For about an hour, Stalin examined, in great detail, all of Roosevelt's conversations.
The Allies agreed that post-war Eastern Europe would be a Soviet zone of influence. Stalin would annex Eastern Poland. As compensation, the Poles would get a slice of Eastern Germany. Poland was offered no choice. Together, the Big Three mapped out the future.